In the glittering world of European royal courts, behind the silk tapestries and golden crowns, existed a darkness that history has deliberately chosen to forget. While we celebrate these dynasties for their grand palaces, their artistic patronage, and their political achievements, we rarely speak of those who paid the ultimate price to maintain royal bloodlines. Young princesses forced into marriages that violated the most fundamental laws of nature and human decency. These weren't just political arrangements or strategic alliances. They were systematic campaigns of psychological and physical destruction designed to preserve power at any cost. Their stories reveal a side of monarchy that challenges every fairy tale we've ever been told, exposing the brutal reality of what it meant to be born female in a world where royal blood mattered more than human dignity. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Then please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared determination to uncover the truth that powerful families tried to bury. The practice of royal incest wasn't born from madness or perversion. It was a calculated strategy designed to concentrate power within bloodlines that believed themselves chosen by divine right. For centuries, European royalty operated under the twisted logic that mixing royal blood with common blood would dilute their supposed divine authority. This belief created a closed system where princesses became nothing more than breeding stock, valued not for their intelligence, creativity, or humanity, but for their ability to produce offspring that could claim pure royal heritage. The selection process itself was dehumanizing beyond imagination. Young girls, some barely past childhood, would find themselves examined by court physicians who evaluated their potential fertility, their physical development, and their likelihood of surviving multiple pregnancies. These examinations were conducted with the clinical detachment of livestock inspections, reducing future queens to their reproductive capabilities. The girls had no voice in these proceedings, no opportunity to express fear or revulsion, no chance to dream of different futures. What made their situations particularly tragic was the complete absence of choice or escape. Unlike noble daughters who might occasionally influence their marriage arrangements, princesses destined for incestuous unions were trapped from birth. Their entire education focused on preparing them for roles as compliant wives to their own relatives, learning to suppress natural instincts of revulsion and to present themselves as willing participants in arrangements that violated every moral boundary. The psychological conditioning began in earliest childhood. Palace tutors would carefully craft lessons about family loyalty, royal duty, and the sacred nature of bloodline preservation. These young girls were taught that their personal feelings were irrelevant compared to their dynastic obligations, that questioning these arrangements represented betrayal of their families and their kingdoms. By the time they reached marriageable age, many had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they couldn't imagine any alternative to their predetermined fate. The wedding ceremonies themselves were elaborate spectacles designed to mask the horror of what was actually taking place. Magnificent cathedrals, filled with music and flowers, streets lined with cheering crowds, and banquets that lasted for days created an atmosphere of celebration that completely contradicted the reality of young women being legally delivered to their own brothers, uncles, or cousins. The pageantry served a dual purpose, convincing the public that these were joyous occasions while reinforcing to the brides that they were participating in something sanctified and honourable. Behind the golden doors of royal bedchambers, however, the true horror began. Wedding nights that should have been gentle introductions to married life became traumatic ordeals for girls who found themselves expected to submit to relatives they had grown up viewing as family members. the psychological damage was immediate and devastating. Many princesses described feeling like they were living in nightmares from which they could never wake, trapped in relationships that violated their deepest instincts about family and intimacy. The physical consequences were often as brutal as the psychological ones. Repeated pregnancies with close relatives dramatically increased the likelihood of complications, miscarriages, and infant mortality. Court physicians, bound by oaths of secrecy, documented horrific birth defects and genetic abnormalities that resulted from these unions, but their reports were carefully hidden away in royal archives, never allowed to influence future marriage decisions. The health and survival of individual princesses remained secondary to the preservation of dynastic power. Palace life for these trapped women became an exercise in constant performance. They were expected to appear happy and fulfilled in public, to play the role of devoted wives while privately struggling with depression, anxiety, and often complete psychological breakdown. Their ladies-in-waiting, sworn to absolute discretion, witnessed daily scenes of despair that could never be acknowledged or addressed. Many princesses developed elaborate coping mechanisms, retreating into religious obsessions, artistic pursuits, or carefully controlled public personas that hid their inner turmoil. The children born from these unions often suffered even more than their mothers. Genetic abnormalities were common, ranging from physical deformities to severe mental disabilities that royal families desperately tried to conceal from their subjects. Infant mortality rates in incestuous royal marriages were significantly higher than in the general population, leading to repeated cycles of pregnancy, birth, and loss that devastated the mothers emotionally, while providing ammunition for political enemies who whispered about divine disapproval of these unnatural unions. Some princesses attempted to resist their fates through various forms of rebellion. They might refuse to participate in wedding ceremonies, attempt to flee the palace, or engage in behaviours designed to make themselves unsuitable as brides. However, these acts of defiance were met with severe punishment that often included imprisonment, forced medication to control their behaviour, or threats against other family members they loved. The power structures surrounding them were so complete that successful resistance was virtually impossible. The most heartbreaking aspect of these stories lies in the personal correspondence that has survived from some of these princesses. Letters hidden away in private collections reveal young women desperately seeking understanding, comfort, or simply someone who would acknowledge their suffering. They wrote about feeling like prisoners in golden cages, about the constant fear of pregnancy, about the revulsion they felt toward their own bodies after being forced into relationships that violated their deepest sense of right and wrong. Religious authorities who should have provided moral guidance and protection instead became enablers of these practices. Special dispensations were routinely granted for marriages that violated church doctrine, with elaborate theological arguments constructed to justify unions that would have been condemned if practiced by common people. The church's complicity was purchased through generous donations and political alliances that made moral considerations secondary to institutional survival and growth. The international diplomatic community was well aware of these practices, but chose to ignore them for political convenience. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about the obvious suffering of royal wives and the genetic problems affecting their children. But these observations were treated as diplomatic curiosities rather than humanitarian crises requiring intervention. The preservation of political relationships took precedence over basic human decency. As these princesses aged, many found themselves trapped in cycles of repeated trauma. Those who survived their childbearing years often lived as shadows of their former selves, their personalities permanently altered by decades of abuse disguised as royal duty. They became cautionary examples for younger generations of princesses, living proof of what awaited those born into the highest ranks of European nobility. The medical consequences of these practices extended far beyond individual families to affect entire dynasties. Royal bloodlines became increasingly unstable, plagued by hereditary diseases, mental illness, and physical abnormalities that weakened their claims to divine authority. Ironically, the very practices designed to preserve royal purity ultimately contributed to the genetic degradation that would eventually undermine monarchical power across Europe. Palace servants and courtiers, sworn to secrecy but human nonetheless, developed their own coping mechanisms for witnessing daily atrocities they could not prevent or report. Many turned to alcohol, developed nervous conditions, or requested transfers to positions that would remove them from intimate contact with the royal family. The psychological toll extended throughout the palace hierarchy, creating environments of fear and complicity that enabled continued abuse. The economic costs of maintaining these dysfunctional royal marriages were staggering. Massive resources were devoted to medical care for genetically compromised offspring, elaborate ceremonies designed to maintain public illusions of happiness, and complex systems of secrecy that required constant management and substantial bribes. Kingdoms spent fortunes maintaining facades that grew increasingly difficult to sustain as the genetic consequences of incest became more apparent. Some royal families attempted to modify their practices while maintaining the essential structure of incestuous marriage. They might arrange unions between more distant relatives or alternate between incestuous and non-incestuous marriages within the same generation. However, these half measures provided little relief for the individual princesses involved and failed to address the fundamental problem of treating young women as expendable resources in dynastic power games. The isolation experienced by these princesses was particularly cruel because it was both physical and emotional. Surrounded by luxury and attendants, they nonetheless lived in profound loneliness, unable to form genuine relationships with anyone who might understand their experiences. Their unique suffering could not be shared with common women, who would have been horrified by their stories, or with other nobles who were complicit in maintaining the systems that oppressed them. The final decades of these princesses' lives often brought a different kind of horror, the realization that their own daughters would face identical fates. Mothers who had endured years of psychological and physical trauma were forced to participate in preparing their children for the same systematic abuse they had experienced. This generational cycle created layers of guilt and complicity that haunted these women until their deaths, knowing they had become instruments of their daughter's destruction. Many developed elaborate rituals around their daily routines, creating small pockets of control in lives otherwise dominated by others' decisions. Some became obsessively religious, spending hours in prayer as their only escape from palace realities. Others threw themselves into charitable work, perhaps finding meaning in alleviating suffering they could acknowledge publicly, even if their own remained hidden. These coping mechanisms provided temporary relief, but could never address the fundamental trauma of their circumstances. The correspondence between these princesses and their few trusted confidants reveals the devastating impact on their ability to trust or love. Women who should have been forming bonds with husbands instead developed elaborate emotional defenses designed to protect what remained of their psychological integrity. Many described feeling like they were watching their lives happen to someone else, a dissociation that allowed them to survive daily horrors but left them feeling permanently disconnected from their own experiences. Palace physicians developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing the physical and mental health consequences of these marriages. Special medications were created to address the unique medical needs of women bearing children with close relatives, while elaborate therapeutic treatments attempted to manage the psychological breakdowns that inevitably followed. However, These medical interventions treated symptoms rather than causes, providing temporary relief, while the fundamental system of abuse continued unchanged. The artistic and cultural output of these royal courts often reflected the psychological damage inflicted on their inhabitants. Music, poetry, and visual arts from these periods frequently contained themes of imprisonment, despair, and longing for freedom that spoke to experiences that could never be directly acknowledged. These creative works serve as coded testimonies to suffering that official histories deliberately obscured. Some princesses found ways to document their experiences through coded diaries, encrypted letters, or symbolic artistic works that preserved their stories for future generations. These hidden testimonies provide our clearest windows into the daily realities of lives lived under constant surveillance and control. They reveal women of remarkable intelligence and creativity whose potential was systematically destroyed by the circumstances of their birth. The international medical community began documenting the genetic consequences of royal incest as early as the 17th century, but their findings were suppressed or ignored by royal families who prioritized political considerations over scientific evidence. Medical professionals who attempted to publicize their research faced professional destruction and exile, ensuring that knowledge about the dangers of these practices remained confined to small circles of specialists. The collapse of these marriage systems didn't come from moral awakening or concern for the women involved. It resulted from the practical impossibility of maintaining royal bloodlines that had become genetically unsustainable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the physical and mental disabilities resulting from centuries of incest had become so severe that they could no longer be hidden from public view, undermining the very authority these practices were designed to preserve. The revolution and political upheavals that swept through Europe during this period were partly fueled by public disgust at royal excesses that included these marriage practices. Common people, learning about the systematic abuse of royal women, began questioning the entire moral foundation of monarchical authority. The princes and kings who had treated their female relatives as breeding stock found their subjects increasingly unwilling to accept divine right arguments from families so obviously corrupted by their own behaviour. Even as these formal practices ended, the psychological legacy continued affecting royal families for generations. Women who had survived incestuous marriages passed their trauma to their children through parenting styles shaped by their own abuse. Palace cultures remained deeply dysfunctional long after the specific practice of forced incestuous marriage had been abandoned, creating environments where emotional and psychological abuse continued in modified forms. The historical record of these practices was systematically sanitized by court historians who understood that documenting the truth would undermine the legitimacy of the monarchies they served. Official biographies focused on political achievements and cultural contributions while completely omitting the personal experiences of royal women. This deliberate historical amnesia has persisted into modern times, with many royal biographies still avoiding honest discussion of these practices and their consequences. Today, tourists visit the palaces where these horrors unfolded, admiring architectural beauty and artistic treasures without understanding the human cost that created and maintained these symbols of royal power. The magnificent bedchambers where young girls were systematically abused are now presented as romantic symbols of royal romance. Their true histories buried beneath layers of sanitized interpretation designed to preserve profitable mythologies about royal grandeur. The genetic legacy of these practices can still be traced in the bloodlines of surviving European royal families, where certain hereditary conditions appear with unusual frequency as direct consequences of centuries of incestuous marriage. Modern genetic counseling has helped break these cycles, but the physical evidence of historical abuse remains embedded in the DNA of current royal family members. Perhaps most tragically, the normalization of these practices created cultural precedents that influenced attitudes toward women's rights and bodily autonomy throughout European society. If royal women, supposedly the most privileged females in their societies, could be treated as expendable breeding stock, it became easier to justify similar treatment of women from lower social classes. The systematic dehumanization of princesses contributed to broader patterns of misogyny that affected all women within these societies. As we reflect on these forgotten stories of systematic abuse disguised as royal tradition, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real human being whose life was destroyed by the accident of royal birth. These princesses were not footnotes to dynastic history, but individuals whose experiences reveal fundamental truths about power, control, and the way societies rationalize unconscionable treatment of their most vulnerable members. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the glittering surfaces of historical narratives to see the human cost of systems that prioritize power over people. They remind us that the most beautiful palaces and the most elaborate ceremonies can mask horrors that destroy human lives while serving the interests of those who refuse to acknowledge the humanity of others. The princesses forced into incestuous marriages lived and died in circumstances that no human being should ever endure, their suffering a testament to the depths of cruelty that institutional power can inflict when it operates without moral constraints or accountability. In remembering these women, we honor their humanity while acknowledging our obligation to ensure that such systematic abuse never again becomes acceptable, simply because it serves the interests of the powerful. Their legacy challenges us to remain vigilant against any system that treats human beings as expendable resources in service of abstract goals like bloodline purity, political power, or institutional preservation.